put a picture up here. I wanted to make a couple of comments about the previous speakers' comments. Uh, I was at a homeschool conference. We home educated our children, and we were at a homeschool conference once, and the presentation was related to some of the stuff that was happening at the tail end there. In particular, the subject that was being addressed there was single parents with children. What do they do? And everything. And I remember the speaker, the first thing he said is we need to remember that God is the immovable object, not us. God is the immovable object, not us. And then he started talking about the church community and saying maybe there are those in the community who can step in and be to those children, to that single parent, what they don't have. And so we really need a lot of that. We really need a lot more. And I really appreciate and enjoyed hearing him speak and hearing the answers from people in the audience here relative to these things, because we often think of things based on our own circumstances and our own situation, and we don't really necessarily think of it the other ways. But God has an answer for all of those things. The big thing is that he uses us to answer those problems sometimes, a lot of the time, and we need to be willing. Another thought that was shared was about, being hasty and buying a place in the country and getting out there and finding you have all these disasters. I want to tell you a couple of stories here where disasters were turned into something fantastic. And it has to do with having the right knowledge and the right understanding about things. And sometimes we don't have those things. And so we look at it based on the knowledge and the perspective that we have. I put this picture up here. This is a client of mine in Nebraska. I've been working with them for 2 or 3 years now. But last year, they asked me, we have these apricot trees. There's 6, I think they were 6 years old. Okay, we're going to switch here. That'll keep me awake. They said these apricot trees are 6 years old. They've never bloomed. Should we just take them out and start again? So I looked at their soil tests and I looked at where they were. They were in like 5B, which is like the limit north generally for apricot trees. Now there are some exceptions to that, but so it could be that they were too far north and the trees were just not going to thrive in that type of climate. But after looking at their soil tests, I noticed 2 things on it. And I said, well, if you're willing to give those trees a couple more years probation, I think we can correct that problem. And so they said, okay, we'll do that. And so I told them what to do. And this is a picture from this spring of those trees in full bloom. Yes. They asked me last year, and I recommended a couple things that they needed to do, and this is the result. The trees are now blooming. Now, unfortunately, they had some pretty rough weather after that, so they only set 1 apricot. But that apricot was precious to them. So I'm sharing that story first, and I'm going to share a couple more. A lot of times when you don't understand what needs to be done, then things look bad to you when they're not going well. I'm going to tell you 2 stories of 2 individuals who understood well the principles of soil fertility and used it to their advantage. One individual was in southwest Colorado, and they were fairly well off. They were a dentist, fairly well off, and they understood these principles, and they wanted to buy a ranch. And so they went to that area, and they asked all the realtors in the area, what is the poorest ranch? What is the worst piece of property that's for sale around here? And every realtor he went to told him the same place. So it must be. Now, what do you think an advantage would be if a place is really poor and nobody wants it? It'd be less expensive. and everything. So he bought this property for very inexpensive. And then he brought in the individual who knew how to correct the fertility on that property. And I'll abbreviate it, but he went to growing hay for racehorses. His market was primarily for really expensive horses in Arizona. And there's a lot more to the story, but the bottom line is he captured the hay market in Arizona, and the owners of these horses would complain to him because they said once we started feeding them your hay, they won't eat anybody else's hay. And he took a piece of property that was worth, very little because people didn't understand why it was so poor, and he corrected it. And in reality, he took the deformities and he reformed them, and has prospered ever since with that piece of properties. I'll tell you one more, and I'll tell you why I'm telling you this. Another individual in California, there was a 70-acre piece of property that for 50 years nobody had been able to get anything to grow on it. There was too much sodium there. There was a lot of salt, and nobody could get anything to grow on it. And you would think somebody within academia or the extension service or the agricultural stuff like that would know what to do. But for 50 years, nobody could grow anything on it. He bought it very cheaply. The guy who sold it to him laughed at him because he thought he was a fool. He did the same thing. He brought in someone who knew how to correct the soil fertility. He opened that soil up, bleached sodium out, and he's got a multi-million-dollar herb farm on that 70 acres today. So it is important for you to do your homework before you go looking, but don't necessarily be discouraged because you see a property. I think if any of you read the book Madison, God's Beautiful Farm, they didn't want them to buy that either. I do fertility for that farm now, and there were reasons why. There are things that they didn't understand that were of value there, but God knew. And so, even though you may find yourself in a circumstance like that because you maybe didn't do your homework or you weren't aware of all the factors, don't become discouraged because a lot of times you can straighten it out and it will be way better than anything you might have ever gotten otherwise as a result. So just wanted to share those two things with you because we do often, go into something kind of with a hand tied behind our back and a little bit blind to the realities of things. It is hard work. I'll just plain tell you that moving to the country is hard work. We're not prepared for it. And so you want to ahead of time prepare yourself as much as possible. This is a great venue to do that, where you have people that are in that experience who can talk to you about the things. Well, I didn't think about this and I didn't think about that and everything. But when you move to the country, there's three basic things you have to have: food, water, and shelter. Whatever else you have above that is wonderful. But so you really need to put a lot of emphasis on the ability to provide yourself those things and recognize, do I have the skills to do that? Do I not have? Do I even know what's required for me to do that? So there is a way. It's a matter of finding what is that way. Because if God called us to do something, he's not going to call us to do something that's impossible to do. And sometimes we're part of that process for other people, like I'd said before. So I just wanted to share that picture as one of hope and promise to you that life has design. It has specificity to it. And if you understand that design, you can take what is broken and put it back together and repair it. Okay, let's go on to pick up where we were before. Let's see if my thing will work. Oh, I may have killed the batteries on it. It's okay. Okay, so these are some of the principles that you need to be mindful of again, it doesn't matter what scale you're talking about, whether it's gardening or if it's large scale farming or somewhere in between. These principles have to be taken into consideration and addressed and embraced to the extent that you can. And then the first one there is complete and balanced chemistry. When we looked at that pie chart of the ideal soil and everything, chemistry is one of the ways that you actually achieve that porosity in the soil. And it's also one of the ways you don't have it. If the chemistry is not right, the soil will not structure very well. And if it is right, it'll structure well. And so you need to address the chemistry of that soil. Now, the big school of thought right now is regenerative agriculture, and it's got the bully pulpit, it's got the dominant voice right now, and it's focused on biology and biology being able to address these issues with the soil. But life is fragile without the foundation that it needs to function, and so it can be damaged and lost fairly easily if you don't have the underpinnings, the support necessary for that. Is it impossible for biology to do beneficial things? No, in fact, you want biology working for you in concert with this. So, but you need complete and balanced chemistry. It affects a lot of things, and we're gonna talk about those things as we continue on with the message here, with the presentation. It affects a lot of things. The other thing you want is living roots in the ground. In other words, you want something growing on that soil as much as possible. How many of you have flown on an airplane over, the Midwest or someplace like that, and you look down in the fall or winter time, and it's just bare ground everywhere? It's not supposed to be that way. And somewhere along the line, we got the idea that a nice, clean, plowed field and everything like that is a good thing. But in reality, it's not. Now, you'll see when we get down to the last one there is a time and a place for that. But to the extent that you can keep something alive growing on that soil, the health of your soil is going to increase and improve as a result of that. The big reason for that is because what are called mycorrhizal fungi depend on a living root to function. And it's those and we're going to talk about that when we get to biology, but it's those mycorrhizal fungi that actually set up a highway and a communication network and cooperation across plants. Not just the same kinds of plants, but different plants. And it's a fascinating subject that we could spend the whole week talking about, just the networking and the communication. Man didn't originate that. And in fact, we haven't even come close yet to how sophisticated and how capable this communication network is within the the microbial community. So you want that because, and you'll see as we go along that the more there's something growing on that soil, the healthier it's going to get. The next one there is keep it covered. Now, I'd mentioned the back to Eden method, and I'd asked anybody earlier if anybody had used that method. The primary objective of that is to keep the soil covered. By keeping the soil covered, preferably with something alive, but if not, with a mulch. It can be a wood chip mulch. It can be a variety of hay, straw. There's a variety of things, leaves. Somebody mentioned they use leaves. There's a variety of materials that you can use to cover that soil. But what it does is it actually keeps the soil at a more stable situation. So the temperatures are better, the moisture levels are better, the surface of the soil stays looser so that water can infiltrate and air can exchange in the soil. So you want to keep it covered. Now, I'll give you an illustration of what happens when you don't keep it covered. And it can get very extreme. But in West Texas, they were doing some research and everything. And where they had a crop growing on the soil, the air temperature was 105. Where they had a crop, cover crop on the soil, take a stab at what the temperature was. It was 105-degree air temperature. It was right around 70, which is a great temperature for. I mean, wouldn't you like a 70 degrees? That's pretty comfortable to us, isn't it? And to the microbes, the same. Where the soil was not covered, where the air temperature was 105, underneath the cover crop, it was 70. It was near 150, the temperature. And all this stuff they call climate change and all this heat gain and everything that's supposed to be happening. We are gaining heat. It's not to the extreme that what the bigger problem here, and we'll touch on some of this with other topics we get to. The biggest problem is instability. The weather is becoming more unstable because the buffers that are supposed to be there to maintain stability are pretty much being destroyed or neglected. So you can see the difference. Would you like functioning, trying to do your job in 150-degree temperature? 70 would be a lot more preferable. And that the only difference was, and remember, the temperature of the air was 105. So it was 35 degrees cooler than the air temperature underneath that growing crop. Okay, the next thing you want to focus on is diversity. I'm going to show you some pictures. I don't have them loaded up on my thing yet here of how we do this. But the more the diversity you have in your garden, the healthier it'll be. And the reason for that is that different types of plants tap different parts of the root zone. They pull different things. But remember I said that those mycorrhizal fungi, they actually connect those different plants to each other. And they begin communicating. I don't remember if I have it in. I believe I do later, but I'll just mention it here just in case I don't. There's an ongoing experiment going on in Germany, the Jena experiments, and where they're doing research on having a single crop, having more 2 crops, 4 crops, 8 crops, 16 crops, all growing together. And the interesting thing that what they saw was that the fields with 16 crops, the soil health of the soil improved much quicker than where there were less. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because one year they're right along a river, and one year they got flooded out, and all this research they were doing for years they thought had been lost, and some of the fields were underwater for quite a while. But some of the plants were taller, and they were sticking out of the water. And the interesting thing that they discovered when the water went back down is the plants that were underwater, that should be dead, were still alive. They were alive because the plants that were sticking up out of the water were feeding them and helping them. It's a great lesson for us as a community in that. So how do you do that in a garden? For example, I wish I forgot to upload these pictures to my slide set here, but I'll show them to you. I'll get them loaded up and we'll show them to you tomorrow. We have, like, growing down one of our beds in our high tunnel, we'll have bamboo poles set up and train pole green beans or a shelling bean, pole shelling bean, up those poles. And on either side of them, like this year, one side we had half a row up, we had spinach, and then a half a row up, we had beets. And on the other side, we had 2 different varieties of carrots that came in, matured at different times. And on another bed, we had some more shelling beans the same way, and then we had onions going down either side of that. And so you can if you have a limited amount of space and you don't want to just put something there, although it would be beneficial too, even if you put something there just as a cover, as a diversifying species in your bed, it would still be helpful. This is what companion planting is all about. Has anybody heard about companion planting, where you plant different things together and they benefit each other? Well, the same thing. So, but you can have, productive crops that you're going to consume and do the same thing in your garden, where you're just planting different things. Some things have a shallow root zone. Some things have a deeper root zone. Some things like a little bit of shade. Like if you're in the heat of summer and you're trying to grow lettuce or some greens and things like that, they don't like all that heat. And so if you can put it so that they're partially canopied by a taller growing crop, then you can be more successful at growing that and getting the benefit of having diverse amount of plants growing together in your garden. So you don't have to sacrifice the space. You can have the benefit of a productive crop. Okay, so the next thing is minimal disturbance. Now, this is a controversial one. Has anybody ever read the Spirit of Prophecy quote where it says plow often and plow deep? Okay. So this seems to go at odds with that statement. Now, I'm saying that because I want to clarify that. For one thing, we automatically assume when she says that you have to use iron to plow. You can use plants to plow too, tap-rooted crops like alfalfa or sweet clover or tiller radishes, daikon radishes. There's a variety of crops that will produce a taproot. Now they'll do their job better if the chemistry in that soil and the structuring of that soil is a lot better and the nutrients are there in necessary amounts for them to do that. But you don't have to use iron. And then the other thing you need to realize is, what am I doing the tillage for? Why are you tilling? You don't just need to exercise your back or your tiller or your tractor just to make sure it gets work because you paid for it. And there's a purpose for tillage, right? So maybe you're preparing a seed bed. Well, how deep do you need to go to prepare a seed bed? Maybe you have compaction. Maybe your soil is hard and it doesn't drain well and it doesn't work well and everything. So it has to be broken up. So you may want to go deeper with that. What is the tool to use to do that? Okay, so you might use a broad fork. You might use if you're in a field crop situation, you might use a big subsoiling ripper or something like that. Sometimes you don't need to do anything to the mid zone, and that's what you need to do is just bring they have in Australia what's called the yeoman's plow. It's a subsoiling plow that I think is superior to anything we have in North America, because the man who developed it with refinement rather than just brutal force. And so it works its way through the soil, lifting and dropping without doing a lot of disturbance and a lot of damage. But it's interesting where you see where they take that through a field. You can see to the line where they did it, because the field where they introduced some air into that soil is greener than the area where they didn't do it. And again, this is about, we haven't got to that really yet, but about the ability of a soil to breathe. Now, you notice I use the term breathe here. Air needs to come in and out, not just in. And so that's why you're doing the tillage. If you're preparing ground, you're loosening it up to plant. If the soil is hard, you have to till it. Then you have to till it to try to loosen it enough for plants to grow in it. If it's already got good structure and everything, all you may need to do is just till 2 inches, work 2 inches. The goal here is for moisture to be able to penetrate and air to be able to penetrate. You can say that it's the softening of your heart. Now, God plowed Pharaoh's heart. And what was the result? It got harder and harder and harder. Now, the reality is you can do the same thing with soil. The illustration is there. And if a person is willing to learn the spiritual lessons that you'll learn in the garden, that's another good reason to do it, is because there's tremendous lessons that can be learned. And when you see in what God made the same truths being manifest as what he said, it brings deeper conviction. At least that's what the Spirit of Prophecy says. And I believe that. It brings deeper conviction. So Pharaoh's heart became totally hard. And if you do that same thing with plowing ground and not addressing the character of that soil, it will get harder and harder and harder until it's so hard you can't, nothing will grow. Because air and water can't get in, it can't breathe anymore. Spirit of God can't penetrate the heart anymore and minister to it. So it doesn't really contradict that statement of plowing often and plowing deep. Her objective there was to make sure that the soil of the heart was open and receptive to the truths of God. But there's a lot of practices that you need to implement in order to achieve that. Because you can see, if you just plow and you don't really ever address the character, you'll wind up like Pharaoh, with a hardened heart that is, rebelled against God. So I just want to, because I've had people bring that up to me with, well, Ellen White says this, but like I said, you don't have to use a plow to plow often and plow deep. You can use a plant root. You can use chemistry. And when I say chemistry, I'm talking about inorganic chemistry. I'm talking about mineral elements. I'm not talking about organic chemistry, man-made organic chemistry, because inorganic chemistry, honestly doesn't matter if it's mined or manufactured. If it's stable chemistry, it's fine. If it's extreme chemistry, like for example, if you have, and most of you guys probably aren't familiar with that, I wouldn't use it, but anhydrous ammonia for nitrogen has a pH of 12 and will denature everything that it hits when they knife it in to get water and to stabilize. Nature is always going to try to stabilize everything. So that kind of chemistry is not great chemistry, but I've had to work with growers who insisted that's what I'm going to use. So then it becomes, how do you intelligently help this grower to use something that's not the desirable method? Because if you can win their confidence, then they're willing to open their ears a little bit more and listen to what you might say about something better. And you can do that. I've had to do that with growers, and if I can get them to listen to me and do things, even though it's not the best method, even though it's not the best way, and to tell you the truth, God has to work with us this way a lot of the time. We're pretty stubborn sometimes, and we insist on our way. And so God has to work with us that way, and it may cause a little bit of pain and difficulty and stuff. But if it gets us to their ears, will be receptive and will listen. He can then take us on. And this is typically what's happened with growers where they insist on using these types of chemistry that are extreme and are damaging in the process. The opposite extreme of that is where they've concentrated phosphorus as triple superphosphate with a pH of 3 on the opposite side of the spectrum, where again, when it hits the soil, nature is going to try to stabilize it and bring it back into balance. And in the process, it's going to tie things up. And so it's not the best method. But as far as inorganic chemistry goes, whether it's manufactured or it's mined, as long as it's stable chemistry, it doesn't really matter. Organic chemistry is an entirely different animal. And there hasn't been a whole lot that man has produced in that field that has been very beneficial to life, to tell you the truth. So I avoid that as much as I can. But I even have people, we'll go to that last one there, know your context. We even have people, who use all kinds of chemistries that we know are not good for human health. The number one material used in agriculture as an herbicide is glyphosate or Roundup. It's a labor-saving device because they can kill off all the messengers and grow the crop. And so you have these genetically engineered crops that can grow in spite of the Roundup being sprayed. They're on a starvation diet, though, by the way, because glyphosate or Roundup is a chelator. It chelates trace minerals and prevents the plant from getting them. Well, guess what? It does to you too. When you're consuming foods like that, the foods themselves are deficient in those cell materials, and then the residuals can do the same thing to you in your gut on it. But here's the reality: we have the vast majority of the food produced in this country utilizes these chemistries. And their whole system, which is something we haven't talked about yet, but their whole system is set up based on using these chemistries. And so if you all of a sudden told them, okay, you can't use this anymore, you would have millions of people dying from starvation. But that doesn't mean that you have to embrace that reality. This is another motivation to move to the country and learn how to grow your own food. In case I'm not going to mention it anywhere else, too, I'll just say there's all kinds of practices being done now that you don't know anything about. And it can be utilized in certified agriculture, and they don't have to say anything. So you don't know when you're buying certified organic produce whether it's really good for you or not. Now, I will tell you that certification like that is really a marketing advantage, Because people assume that when you say I'm certified organic or I'm organic, that means that your food is clean and nutritious. But it doesn't necessarily mean that your food is clean and nutritious. But that's what people assume. So it's a marketing advantage on that. Um, but we have this reality where we are, and we need to get to a better place. So the question is, how do we get from where we are to that better place? And if you're waiting on the world to embrace this reality, you will be waiting until the day you die. Because there are vested interests that have advantages based on this paradigm and this system, and they're not gonna give it up. They're not going to abandon. In fact, they're happy to have you die rather than them alter their course on this. And in fact, I was sharing with the regenerative agriculture, which is the big thing now, which is using biology, focusing on biology and encouraging biology. A lot of these big companies have embraced that, and I'd share with you why they embraced it, because they can use this whole carbon credit system to be able to continue to do what they're doing and just buy these credits from people who are supposedly sequestering carbon, and in the long run it won't change anything. It'll just be the same or worse on it. Okay, so these are the principles that you need to consider in your garden. You know, what is the condition of my chemistry? You know, am I keeping something alive on that soil? And if I'm not able to do it all the time, am I at least keeping it covered? And then can I keep diversity? You know, there were 12 manner of fruit on the tree of life. God gave us a variety of foods to nourish ourselves with, and we should take advantage of that. And then, you know, minimally disturbing, doing what you have to do. That soil, like I said, has to be able to breathe. It has to be able. It has to have. We'll talk about it again later, but it has to have that porosity, which allows it to breathe and have capillarity. And what I mean by that in capillarity is that the ability to water and move up and down. You know what a tide does? You know, on a lake, if you're on a lake or a river or the ocean, and the tide comes in and it goes out. Well, that same tidal influence that the moon has on the earth, it does the same thing with water in the soil. It brings it up, sends it down, brings it up, sends it down. If it's able to move on that. And that's what you want it to be able to do on there. And then of course you have to know what your context is. What am I doing? Some things you're going to have to disturb soil. Like if you're growing potatoes and you're going to furrow it and you're going to plant the potatoes and you're going to hill potatoes, you're going to be working that soil quite a bit. Some crops have to have a clean seed bed to grow, like carrots. Anybody grow carrots? They're little bitty seeds on there. They're not going to do well trying to plant them into a growing crop or, you know, a thick residue of material. Now, one of the solutions people have for that now is to put a thick layer of compost on. And this is another one of those situations where we were talking about the leaves and using the leaves. People don't think about how much of what things they're putting on in the amount of material they're putting on. If you're going to put compost on, we'll talk about this more, so I won't get into a lot of details on. In nature, 10, 15, 20,000 pounds of the acre, I'd have to translate that to hectares, but it's about the amount of material that would be laid down at any given time, depending on the crop that you're growing. And when you put compost on or composted organic materials onto your soil and to use as a mulch, most of the time, well, that 10, 15, 20,000 pounds of material would look like a light dusting on your soil. It wouldn't look like you put a whole lot there. And yet people are putting down 1 inch, 2 inches thick, sometimes as much as 4 inches thick of compost. They're using it as a mulch to suppress weeds. And they plant into it. But you're talking about, if you get up into the higher end of that, you're talking about 100,000 pounds of material on a per acre basis. And if you just had something, and I'll use phosphorus because this is the major problem. If you have phosphorus in that compost, which you do, at just 0.5%, well, that's 500 pounds. Is that 500 pounds? 1% would be 1,000 pounds. Yeah. So 500 pounds from just that one application. The maximum level of phosphorus you would ever want in your soil is 750 pounds. So if you had 1% phosphorus in that material, depending on what the material was that was composted, you're now at 1,000 pounds. You're over. And you start developing all kinds of problems. As a result, you're tying things up, and the downside to this one is almost everything else we know how to get it out if there's too much. But phosphorus, nobody knows how to get it out. And I know growers who have been trying to grow it out with crops for 25 years. And believe it or not, their level has not moved. Not just, it hasn't gone down at all. And there's some reasons for that, because there's some native phosphorus in most soils, and so it just stimulates the microbes in your soil to the point where they just keep breaking out phosphorus, and it's a problem you just want to avoid if you can. So knowing your context, what you're trying to do, what is it I'm actually doing, what am I contributing to this, and we'll talk a little bit more about that and the difference between earth elements and air elements, and how the air elements go back to the air, the earth elements stay behind. And so compost is like testimony for a witness. It's somebody else's testimony. Now, it might be from your garden. You're composting material from your garden, and putting that on is not as big of a deal as if you're bringing a bunch of material in, because generally you're not generating enough material to produce a huge amount of compost. But if you're bringing somebody else's in, it's like listening to somebody's testimony. There are things about their testimony you can relate to a lot of times. Sometimes you can't relate to anything, but there's sometimes you can relate to some of their experience and what they've gone through in life and everything like that. But can you relate to everything? Most people don't ever think about that and so when you bring this compost in, if you're bringing it in from somewhere else, what are you bringing in? What are you putting into your heart? Same as what are you putting into your soil on it? Okay, so those things need to be considered whenever you're looking at what you're doing with your garden to get the healthiest soil that you possibly can to produce, high quality, nutrient dense food out of it. And by the way, I work with a lot of certified organic growers, and I'll tell you, the majority of them have phosphorus excesses because they all practice this thing where you can't get enough organic material. Just pile it on and pile it on and pile it on. But the Bible says, thus far and no further. Now, when is the point where it's as far as you should go and you should stop? But we don't think about, we put it on for nitrogen, we put it on for, carbon, energy, and everything. We don't think about all the other things that are actually in there that you really need to be mindful of. Okay, enough on that. So let's look at how the soil actually works to provide nourishment to growing plants. There are three facets to that. The first one is the colloidal exchange complex. That's clay, humus, and the plant roots. And the term colloid, I don't know if I have the terms slide in here or not. The term colloid means it just has a charge to it. And in this case, all three of these primarily have a negative charge to them. And that negative charge, what does a negative charge attract to it? A positive charge. And we'll see when we get into the chemistry how the soil actually holds nutrients through this charged complex. There is some positive charges to it, and we'll get into that again when we get into the humus, into the carbon fertility part and the humus. The humus is the largest positive charge, has the largest positive charge capacity, much higher than the clay or the root in that complex. And so we really want our organic matter levels to be really good at that pushing that 5% level. And there's other reasons we'll look at when we get there. And I've just mentioned it, organic matter or humus storage. I got ahead of myself. In humus storage, you have both negative charge sites and you have positive charge sites. And mineral elements have charges to them. Some of them have a positive charge to them or attracted to the negative charge on these sites, and some of them have a negative charge and are attracted to the positive charge sites in these complexes. And so the humus, like I said, the humus storage is where the largest amount of positive charge is that can adhere negatively charged materials, and that would be phosphorus, that would be molybdenum, that would be boron, that would be nitrogen in the nitrate form. I'm missing some sulfur. This is remember when I was saying that sulfur is becoming really deficient? This is where you're able to store it if you can develop this and you apply the sulfur. It leaches out every year. If I ever see a soil and there's still a lot of sulfur there, it's usually one of the indicators that that soil doesn't have good structure. It can't drain out. And so if I see an accumulation there, unless it was applied fairly recently, then there's a problem with the structuring of that soil. But you can store it. Nitrate, boron, molybdenum. Yeah, you may have never heard of molybdenum, did you? Anybody have aphids? Well, it's a good chance you don't have enough molybdenum. We'll get to that. We're going to talk to that. Okay, so you have these exchange complexes which have charges to them. You have your mineral complex, you have your humus or organic matter complex, and then you have microbial action or interaction, and that's where the microbes, the biology in the soil interacts with this complex. And in particular, especially as bacteria will exchange acidity or alkalinity, depending on which element they're trying to get with this complex in order to take that mineral nutrient and build it into its own tissue. And we'll get to that eventually, but you'll see in a healthy soil, a lot of the nutrition that a plant needs actually comes from microbes in the soil. And in fact, microbes taken up into the plant root and the nutrients taken from it and then let back out again to start the process over. And the advantage to this living system is that the energy efficiency that's gained by it provides for you the fat of the land, as the Bible calls it, the pressed down and overflowing condition in your soil and in your crops and your product. We'll cover more of this in detail with that when we get to that section there. So, but this is how it all happens in the soil. So the plant root can exchange a hydrogen ion for a calcium ion, or two. It would be 2 hydrogen ions for 1 calcium ion. It can do that exchange. The bacteria can do the same thing, and then the plant take the nutrition from the bacteria, and we'll talk about that process as well. And so this is what happens. Or the other thing that can happen is as the microbes take those nutrients and build their own tissue, then they're able to break mineral nutrition out of the parent material, out of the other rock particles, mineral particles in the soil. They're actually able to break that down and release it and make it available for the plants. We'll get into the details of these when we get into that, how that stuff all works. But this is how it works. So once you get done these few hours with me, you'll know more probably than most agronomy students about what actually works in the field, not theoretically, but what actually works in the field. And if you would apply them, implement them, you would have tremendous success with your garden or whatever enterprise it is, or whatever scale it is. Okay, well, we're working on it. Yeah, we're working on it. We're working through everything here. We have to kind of do this trying to establish these principles or these concepts before we get into more specific stuff, so you understand why we're doing what when we're talking about it, why we're doing what we're doing here. But yeah, we're going to get to that. I mentioned this earlier, the difference, but I didn't go into detail on it. The difference between photosynthetic production and biosynthetic production. Most of the food that's produced is photosynthetic production. Even in fruits and vegetables, it's all about how you can get yield, not necessarily how you can get nourishment from it. So photosynthetic production produces carbonaceous bulk energy, captures solar energy, and stores it as energy in bulk. So it's calories. It's primarily energy and calories, as I say here. And it's yield driven. And most people producing a crop for market are yield driven. The more they can produce, the more they're going to get paid. But it's not necessarily nourishing. So what we want to look at is biosynthetic production. And biosynthetic production produces mineralized proteinaceous bulk. It's a complete food source and it's quality driven. That's what you want. You don't have to, by the way, sacrifice yield and quantity for quality. Actually, I know growers that are producing higher yields of high quality food than the ones that are producing photosynthetic production, just bulk. You can have both. But the problem is that these growers don't get paid for that. The consumer is not willing to pay what it takes to actually produce nutritious food. So you're going to have to take that into your own hands and make that decision yourself to produce nourishing food. We produce, well, we're not back up to that. When we lived in Colorado, we were producing 85 to 90% of all the food we ate on it. And we didn't get sick. We didn't have very many problems at all, health-wise. I have taken, over the years, I've taken many people who had allergies to foods and made it possible for them to eat those foods again because they were grown right. Anything. Now, it depends on how, I'll use a term here, I don't know if you mean what it means. It depends on how epigenetically entrenched it is as to what it might take to eventually get to the place where you could consume a food. Again, it's one of those things like B12 here. I said, don't go out saying, oh, I can get you off your allergy and things like that. And like I had a person that hadn't eaten tomatoes in 50 years. And so I asked them, I said, well, how bad a reaction do you have if you eat them? Oh, it's not real bad. It's just not pleasant and everything. And I said, so, well, are you willing to try a tomato? And the person said, yeah. And they ate it, and they loved it, and had no reaction. And ate tomatoes grown that way ever since without a problem. Now, I asked the question beforehand because I don't want to kill anybody. You need to understand what is the degree of the allergy, and you don't want to take somebody like with a nut allergy from like peanuts or something like that. And it's actually not an allergy to the peanuts. It's an allergy to the aflatoxin that's in the peanut butter or on the peanuts that gets in the fields. And this is how you can eliminate the problem, is simply by growing the peanuts in a field where the aflatoxin doesn't persist. But that's primarily the reason that people are allergic to peanuts, is because of the aflatoxin that's part of the peanut. And that can be eliminated by properly growing the peanut as well. Okay. So like I said, what you want is minerally dense, proteinaceous food. And we're going to get to a pyramid here, hopefully we will, where we're going to go down through this and see how you build food as medicine and what happens when you actually build food as medicine in your soil. I mentioned this earlier, but the goal here is to feed the soil and let the soil feed the crop. And this is what, when we're talking about character, there's all kinds of ways human beings are good at manipulating appearances and circumstances and everything like that, so that you can make it look like things are going well. You can do this with agriculture too, where, like I said, you can grow a crop on poor soil and use interventions to keep that crop alive until you harvest it. In fact, they use breeding and things like that to produce crops that look beautiful. Have you ever gone to the store and you saw this beautiful peach, or you saw this beautiful tomato and you bought it and you got it home and it was mealy or just watery, or it's just so disappointing. I tell people I like melons. I've said I love growing melons and everything. And one of the things on honeydew melons, I tell people, because everybody wants to go and get the nice smooth skin, and you should be able to get one with a nice smooth skin. If it's grown right, you can get one with its nice smooth skin. It has great flavor and is really sweet. But most of the time, the way they're grown, when you get one with a nice smooth skin, it's not going to be very good. So I tell them, you want one with all those scars on it. Because what's happening there is that it's tissue, there's not enough copper in it. So as the fruit is expanding, the skin is tearing and then it's healing over and you get these scars. But that happens because the sugar content is fairly high in there. So your odds of getting one that's going to taste really good is going to be the ugly one that has all that scarring all over it. So been through the trials, yeah. But like I said, when I mentioned earlier, is that it really has to do with our character. A lot of other things in life work out well when our character is right. And we have all these ways of, as human beings, in nature, one of the things when you go to the garden, when you go to nature, nature doesn't lie to you. It doesn't manipulate, it doesn't deceive, it doesn't play games with you, kind of like people can and everything. It's going to tell you just exactly like it is. And you're not going to like it most of the time. And this is a good thing about it because it's really humbling to us. You find yourself, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do here. This is all falling apart. What do I do? And that's when you have to pursue the right knowledge. You have to pursue understanding. You have to ask God, hey, what do I do here? I don't know what to do. And you're open to, and you're willing to and receptive to listening to what might be the solution or would be the solution to that. But nature doesn't. So when you get out there and you're working with that garden and the diseases come and the insect pests come and the weeds start taking it over and everything, and you're bewildered and frustrated. I was just listening to a presentation by Jean-Martin Fortier. He's here in Quebec, Canada, through Market Garden Institute, and he's a market grower and everything, just talking about a couple that had just come and quit right in the middle of the season. We can't handle it. We can't deal with it anymore. They had a CSA, had to give all their money back to all their members and everything. We just couldn't deal with it anymore. But like he said, and he's not a Christian, to the best of my knowledge and everything, he says, but when you're going through hell, keep on going. You're going to run up against really hard stuff, really frustrating stuff. And I'm just talking about a gardening, trying to grow food. But when you move to the country, you're going to run up against some difficult things, some challenging things, and you have to remember why you're doing it. Or you're just going to want to give up. Say, I can't deal with this. I can't handle it. You don't have the same ability to gloss it over, to manipulate it, and everything. You can by using like these interventions that I was talking about. You can do that, but eventually you'll pay the price for it because you'll have to have interventions too. Your health will suffer as a consequence of pretending like there wasn't anything wrong here by killing the messenger. It just doesn't work. Cause and effect always has its way. So it doesn't matter the crop you're growing, the soil, that if it's healthy and balanced, will provide any crop with what it needs to produce nutrient-dense food. So the goal is to focus on the character of the soil and let that take care of whatever it is you want to produce and grow. You can grow without fertilizers, but you can't grow without fertility. I have a lot of people say, well, I have people that believe that everything you need is in the soil. It's already there. I have people too also tell me that you can get all the nutrition you need out of a can. And in some cases, it's more true than others, but in no case is it completely true. That soil is deformed as a result of the flood and as a result of what's been done to it since the flood. And it needs to be reformed into the right condition that it should be in order to produce healthy, balanced food. So if you don't want to use fertilizers, and when I say fertilizers, a lot of people just associate that with a very limited number of things like nitrogen. I mean, a lot of people, when you say fertilizer, you're thinking about nitrogen. or phosphorus or potassium, the big three that people utilize most of the time in that incomplete chemistry, approach, selective chemistry approach. But if a plant needs, let's say, the problem is a lot of the data that we have is based on flawed practices. And so you have to kind of extrapolate from that data. Okay, what is the real situation here? For example, on nitrogen, they'll say you have to have so many pounds of nitrogen to produce so much of a certain crop. Well, is that because you put it on all at once and half of it leached out and only half of it actually got used? So that's why you need that much? Or does the plant really only need about half as much? But if it's supplied in a form where it's going to be available all season long so the plant can have it when it needs it, is it only 50 pounds as opposed to 100 pounds that you need? So some of those things you have to work out. But if a plant needs 100 pounds of nitrogen, and we have a measure called estimated nitrogen release, it's a test that's done that can tell you based on how much organic matter you have in your soil, how much nitrogen is going to be released from that on an annual basis. And you can count on that number. It's pretty reliable. So let's say a soil has a ENR of 50. So that means you're going to get 50 pounds of nitrogen from that soil, that growing season. But you need 100. Where are you going to get it from? The plants, if it actually needs 100 and you only have 50, that other 50 is going to have to come from somewhere. So you're going to decide how is the plant going to get that? Now, am I going to stimulate the natural nitrogen fixers in the soil? How much can I get out of that? If you have rain with thunder and lightning, you can get a little bit of nitrogen from that. Am I going to put other materials on that are going to have nitrogen in it? But either which way, you've got to come up with the plant, what the crop actually needs to produce the crop, a healthy crop. So if you don't need any fertilizers to do that, you have adequate fertility in your soil, then you can grow without fertilizers. But you're not going to grow without fertility. Okay. We can just skip this one, right? Nobody needs to know anything about it. I love it when I just get the response on that one every time. It's like I don't have to go anywhere and expect any different response. Because I don't know very many people that don't have problems with bugs and diseases. So, okay, so let's get into it a little bit. I mentioned that you can grow crops without any disease and without any pest pressure, and you can. So let's see how that happens, because it's not just some kind of theoretical idea. It's not just some kind of speculation. It's very practical science as to why you have insect and disease pressure on your plants. And we're gonna look at it. This next slide is and you probably won't be able to read all of that. But you can, if you go on YouTube, you can look up the plant health pyramid and you can get this, and there's actually a whole course on this with a lot of detail on it you can do from Advancing Eco-Ag. This is produced by them. And so I didn't want to reinvent it all, so I just utilized it to make the point. There are different levels of plant function. But I want to read what it says down on the bottom. It says, if we wish to produce food as medicine, this is where the medicine is. And if you want your food to preserve your health and restore your health and everything, this is what you're going to have to do. And if you do this, the most discouraging thing to me is to be at a school or at a health center and see a food service truck back up to the kitchen. This is one of the areas that we have the greatest potential to change the impact on our children, on ourselves, is through nourishment. And I might as well add now, because I might forget to do it later. It is the greatest opportunity we have right now to witness to the world. Did you know that? Food is a wide open door right now, and it has no stigmas with it. And everybody eats. And it doesn't matter how you reach a person's heart. And what matters is you reach them with something better. And they will respond to that. I could share a lot of stories, and it's one I share a lot because I really like the illustration it makes. When I was out at Eden Valley in Colorado, teaching and working there, we had and this is actually at Eden Valley is where I first learned about how to do agriculture correctly. And it wasn't from them, it was from somebody that came there and shared with us there. But I had a doctor who would drive 2.5 hours each way to buy produce twice a week. And he would come. I mean, he was wealthy. He drove a Mercedes coupe. He wore $1,000 suits and $500 shoes. And he came that way most of the time when he came to get his produce. But sometimes he would come and he'd bring a $5 lawn chair from Walmart and ask, "You mind if I set my lawn chair up and just hang out with you for a little while?" Or he would ask sometimes, would you mind if I took my shoes off and just walked out in the fields? It's an interesting relationship. But the atmosphere was one that was healing to him. And so the longer he could linger there and soak it in, there is some virtue to walking barefoot in your fields and your gardens, by the way. You don't have time to get into all that, but try it. You might sleep really a lot better with it. So one time he'd come and I felt bad because he's driving 2.5 hours one way twice a week. And I just said, I felt bad. Is there nowhere? Now, this is like marketing. No. Is there nowhere else that you can get your produce so you didn't have to drive so far? And his answer is just fabulous to me. He said, we've tried every direction, different places, closer. And he said, I don't know what you guys do different than everybody else. But he said, when we eat your food, we feel better. We sleep better. When we wake up in the morning, we feel refreshed. We get along better with each other. We're more hopeful and optimistic. Do you believe food could do that to you? He said, so if I have to drive 2.5 hours to get that, I will. I'm sharing that story because we don't want to do what the rest of the world is doing. We want to bring them something better. And what I'm sharing with you is something better. One of the things I always tell market growers when I'm talking to them, or students are going to go into, market growing or for school or whatever, is if you go to the marketplace and you do things just like everybody else, then your voice is no louder than anybody else's. But if you go into the marketplace, or if you just go to your neighbor and you bring them something better, it'll change them. It'll affect them. And so it doesn't matter if you enter into their lives through food or Bible studies. Because if you enter with food, these people that were responding like that, we're saying, they get to the point where they say, what else can you do? What are you guys doing? What else do you know about that could help us out? That's what you get. I've got lots of stories about that kind of thing. I won't take the time to do it right now. I will share it, whether it's social nourishment, the world's starving for fellowship. It's starving for fellowship. People are so isolated now, even as connected as we are with all the social media and network, internet, and all that kind of stuff. People are isolated and they're lonely. And I have another story that I like to tell all the time too. Is some friends of ours. They used to live in Hawaii. They're in Colorado now. Very social people, vegan. Somebody called. They had something for sale on Craigslist, and somebody called inquiring about it. And they said, "Yeah, they wanted to come by and look at it." I said, "Yeah, sure, come on by and look at it. We're just getting ready to sit down to lunch. You want to join us for lunch when you come?" Now, can you imagine if you're on the other side of the phone and somebody you have no idea who this is inviting you to lunch, and they're vegan on top of that. Now, in this crowd, that's not that big of a deal, not a big deal at all. But for the average person, especially in Hawaii, you guys are like, "Oh, no, I don't have the time for that. I just have a few minutes. I just want a quick run by and see if I really wanted this thing." I said, "Yeah, sure, come on." And so the guy came over and looked at the thing and decided he wanted it. Well, they asked him again if he wanted to stay for lunch. If you're going to want to stay for lunch, and they're very, they're very likable people. I mean, very talk and social and everything like that. And the guy said, okay. And this guy who supposedly only had 10 minutes to run over there and look at it and see if he wanted it or not was there for 2 hours, ate lunch with him, and sat there visiting. I'm just sharing some of these things. This is kind of off the subject, but it isn't really. Is that if you nourish somebody, truly nourish them, then they will want to know what other ways you can nourish them. And so whether you start with a Bible study and you go to these other things, or if you start with food or fellowship or any of those things, and you actually bring them something better. If you're going to do things like everybody else does them, well, maybe not. It might work, it might not work. But you have a very loud voice with people if you actually truly bring nourishment to them and nourish their lives. So anyway, that was a side note, but let's get back to this pyramid here. I'm just going to read some of this to you because you may not be able to read it. It says up top there, optimal nutrition enables advanced function in plants. And I'll read the smaller print here. It says, as soils and crops transition towards biological farming practices, now he promotes regenerative ag. And I don't disagree with biological farming practices, just saying that's why he's saying this. They pass through stages of increasingly better health. And you'll see that chemistry matters. It's the bottom of that pyramid. It's foundational. The progression towards better health restores the natural and biological abilities of the plant and soil system. Innate characteristics and advanced functions are enabled, such as immunity to soil and airborne pathogens, resistance to insects, production of lipids which strengthen cell membranes for tastier, more storable fruit, and more. And so let's just go up this because it's 1, 2, 3, 4. We're going to go up here, and this is a simplification of this whole thing. It's not all the details on it. Like I said, you can go on and you can listen to a presentation he does on this, or they have a course that you can take that goes even into more detail relative to this whole subject. But I put it here because it's going to illustrate to you how you eliminate insect and disease pressure. So that's why we're looking at it. Level 1 at the bottom, successful photosynthesis. Remember I said that plants generally only photosynthesize at about 25% of their capacity? Do you think they're supposed to be functioning at 100%? Okay, what if you could just get it to 50%? That would be doubling the capacity of that plant just to get to 50%. And it is possible. Okay, so the small print there, which I don't think you can read, it says the formation of complete complex carbohydrates, such as pectins and other polysaccharides, which build resistance to soil-borne fungal pathogens, such as Fusarium, Alternaria, and Verticillium. What's happening here? Why is it building resistance to these organisms we consider pathogens that tend to do damage and harm to plants? When a plant is photosynthesizing at a higher level, it's producing higher quality photosynthates, and it's producing an abundance of them, and it's actually dumping them. It's giving them away. It's dumping them into the soil, it's dumping it onto the leaves, but primarily it's dumping those photosynthetases into the soil, and it's encouraging very specific microbial populations to proliferate. When these microbial populations proliferate, they protect the plant root, for one thing. And the other thing is these organisms that are pathogenic are now provided a food source that is an alternative to actually consuming the roots of the plant and doing the damage to the plant. And so when you reach this level of successful photosynthesis, a higher level of photosynthesis than is typically achieved, you will eliminate most of the fungal pathogens from doing damage to your plants in the soil. They just won't do it. They're there still, but they have an alternative food source now. And there's other organisms that are actually functioning with the plant to protect the plant root from anything attacking it. So what's required for this? Well, in order to have full photosynthesis, there's certain chemistry that you have to have. The chlorophyll molecule requires magnesium. It requires nitrogen. Magnesium is the center atom, like cobalt is in vitamin B12. Magnesium is a center atom in chlorophyll. And by the way, the structure of chlorophyll and the structure of blood are very similar, except for the center atom. In blood, the center atom is iron. In chlorophyll, the center atom is magnesium. And it's the light spectrum that's reflected that causes one to be green and one to be red. But it performs a very similar function as blood in the body. But you have to have adequate magnesium. We're going to talk about these individual nutritional elements eventually here. You have to have nitrogen in adequate quantities. You have to have iron, because iron is part of the process of building the chlorophyll molecule. You have to have manganese, because manganese is what splits the water molecule to allows, I remember that formula I showed with 6 carbon dioxide atoms or molecules and 6 water molecules, and that produces the sugar. Well, that water molecule has to be split, and manganese is required to split that water molecule. So if you don't have adequate manganese, the whole process can be shut down or stopped or slowed down simply because you can't split enough water molecules. And that manganese actually does that process in a bed of calcium. So calcium is also important in that. Again, this process alone, you could spend hours just talking about the whole photosynthetic process and what all goes into the process of capturing and storing that energy and transferring that energy. Phosphorus is also important in this process because phosphorus is utilized to transport that energy, to transfer that energy to other parts of the plant. And so that's important. So you have to have adequate amounts of these, and we'll talk about what good. Well, there's a difference between sufficient amounts or adequate amounts and optimum amounts. A lot of people, when I work with a lot of growers, they just want to get to what's sufficient. They'll never experience the benefit of optimum mineralization of their soil because they're content with sufficient. We should never be content with sufficient. We should be pursuing excellence. We should be pursuing everything that is good for life on it. So you have to have those things in adequate quantities to get adequate photosynthesis. And the better the conditions with those, and there's other elements involved. I'm just talking about particular ones that will affect how well that plant can photosynthesize. And it also affects whether or not these sugars are converted into complex carbohydrates. This is where you lose a lot of your disease pressure and some of the insect pressure, is because complex carbohydrates are harder to digest than simple sugars. And so organisms that have simple digestive systems can digest the simple sugars, but they cannot break down the complex carbohydrates. And if they try to, it'll kill them. They can't consume it. This is the simple, practical reality of how this changes the conditions here. We have a simpler digestive system. We don't, well, some of us might use wheatgrass juice, but we don't eat grass as a whole like cows do. Cows have a different digestive system than we do. They have enzymes that can break down, cellulase enzymes that can break down, the cellulose in the grass and produce energy out of it for themselves. We don't have those enzymes in our digestive system. Well, different organisms have different levels of functioning digestive systems. Some of them have to have simple compounds. Others can break down more complex compounds, and there's other ways that they're prevented from doing damage to the plant, which we'll get to going up here. But you have to have adequate amounts of those nutrients in your soil. Do you know whether you do or you don't? Even if a crop is growing there, do you know that plant is actually photosynthesizing at a reasonably high level? You don't. Now, there's some ways you can tell. It's usually once the diseases start coming in. Certain diseases start. And this, you can take this, believe it or not, you can take this and say, okay, this is what's happening to my plant. Oh, well, I must not be photosynthesizing adequately. A lot of people, I'm going to talk about soil testing, and I'm going to illustrate taking a soil test later. And a lot of people say to me, well, do we have to do soil tests? And I'm like, well, if you want precise information, that's a really good idea to do that. But there are lots of ways to observe what's going on, and heritage knowledge that can tell you, okay, can narrow down what most likely is going on and what has to be addressed. It might take you 20 or 30 years to acquire that knowledge. So the question is, do you want to wait? There's a lot of that heritage knowledge out there that's dying off. Nobody wants to talk to these people that they have. Like I had a I had a farmer, an old farmer, say in Tennessee when I was at a place there, said, when we were walking in an old orchard, it was kind of decrepit and really wasn't. But he said a couple of things. He said, one, you know what the problem with those trees are? All the energy is going in to preserve the tree and not bearing fruit. And that happens to our institutions a lot of the times. It happens to us, where a lot of the resources just go to preserving us and don't go to bearing fruit. And so that was one thing he said to me. But another thing he said to me was, when the peepers start peeping in the trees, it won't freeze anymore. The peeper, it's a little tree frog. They called them peepers because that's what they start doing. Peep, peep, peep. So they call them. He said, when the peepers start peeping in the trees, it won't freeze anymore. And I tested him for the next 2 or 3 years, and he was right. Every time those frogs started peeping in the trees, it never froze after that. What's that? Oh, well, it's not the frogs that are preventing it from freezing. It's the frogs knowing that the conditions are such that it's not going to freeze again. And you can listen to that. Like if you say, I'm going to plant, I understand your dilemma where this year we grow blueberries. We have about 3/4 of an acre of blueberries, 1,350 blueberry plants. And we lost the whole crop this year because it got so warm in the spring that they bloomed out. And then we got several hard freezes over an extended period of time, and it pretty much took out every variety that we had on it. Now, what's that? No, we don't have that same kind of frog where we are. I have to put a picture, and we do have a little tree frog. He's only about that big, and we'll find them on the corn leaves and the cucumber leaves and everything, just sitting hanging out there. I've got a few pictures of them. I'll try to throw 1 or 2 in to show you. But my point is that there's this knowledge. Like I've had farmers say to me, this is a good field because it walks easy. What do you think that means? The soil gives under your feet. Instead of when you walk on something, when you walk on concrete, how it feels. Have you walked on a field and you feel it give under your feet? On ground, and you feel it give under your feet. It's got good structure. Probably has good calcium levels. And so that's why it gives under your feet. And that's why the farmer would say, well, this is a good field because it walks easy. It's easy on your foot when you walk because it's cushioned and everything. Lots of this knowledge out there. But you know what? The animal kingdom has got a lot more sensitivity to the things happening around it than we do. Our senses have become pretty dull relative to what's actually happening around us and when it's happening and everything. And so we could learn a lot from the animals. Okay. What time am I going to? 5:30? Okay, well, it's 5:36. 5:45. Okay, so we'll run through this. If anybody has any questions afterwards and wants to ask them, we'll do that, or we can maybe take some time after we stop, and I'll just hang around. So step 2. So first step is full photosynthesis. You want to get the maximum amount of photosynthesis you can get, not just a lot of quantity of photosynthesis, but quality photosynthesis, where the plant's producing, complex carbohydrates and producing them in abundance, because then it's able to dump these energy compounds out, and it actually produces specific compounds to attract specific or to foster specific microbial populations in the soil to help it out. So you want that. That eliminates a lot of the soil-borne fungal diseases. If you're functioning at this level fairly highly, you're not likely to have soil-borne fungal diseases on your crop at all. The second level is production of complete proteins. In every 24-hour cycle, any nitrogen that goes into that plant should be metabolized into amino acids, peptides, and proteins. There should be no simple nitrogen in that plant 24 hours later from when it's taken up. Anybody have problems with aphids? That's free nitrate in your tissue. You eliminate the free nitrate in the tissue and you eliminate the aphids. How about thrips, white flies, spider mites? That's ammonium nitrogen. And that's from photorespiration, the plant breaking itself down because it can't photosynthesize, or it's not adequately photosynthesizing, and the conditions are warranted, it has to start breaking itself down, doesn't have adequate surplus energy, and so it breaks proteins down, you get free ammonia in the plant. And that's basically like, any of you remember neon signs? They don't use neon signs very much anymore. But neon sign, it's like putting this big neon sign on the plant saying restaurant open, come and eat. Because they have to have a simple, these organisms have to have, they have simple digestive systems. They have to have a simple nitrogen source. They cannot break down amino acids or peptides or proteins. And so it's because there's, remember I talked about the spotted wing Drosophila? It's the same thing. They have to have simple nitrogen compounds in that plant, and they will build their own proteins from it. They can't break down the others. And if you eliminate the simple nitrogen compounds in that plant, you will eliminate those. I mentioned molybdenum and aphids. Molybdenum is required. It's another one of those materials that's only required in about 2 pounds in a 2 million pound plow layer, 1 part per million. That's all it's required. But without it, you don't get proper nitrogen metabolism. That's part of the nitrate reductase enzyme and required for that, and nitrogenase enzymes, and metabolizing protein. And so, metabolizing nitrogen, I'm sorry. The other material, so molybdenum is a big one. If you see those things, you're not getting the metabolizing of that nitrogen in a 24-hour period. It's accumulating in the tissue, and it's moving to the reason you see aphids on the growing tip of your crops most of the time, because that nitrogen is moving to the growing tip. It's moving where the plant is growing the most active, and so that's where the largest abundance is, and so that's where the aphids go to consume their food source. Now, if it's molybdenum that's missing and you foliar spray molybdenum on there, the aphids will be dead the next day. They'll be completely gone. The next day, 24 hours later, they will all be dead because you've just complexed all of that nitrogen into amino acids or higher, into a complex compound, and they can't consume it anymore. So they'll be gone. It could be sulfur. Sulfur is required. We talked a little bit about sulfur. We'll talk about more when we go to individual elements. That you could be lacking sulfur, and so you can't produce the sulfur containing amino acids, essential amino acids that are necessary to build proteins. And so, molybdenum, molybdenum, molybdenum. So it could be a lack of sulfur. Sulfur leaches out of the soil easily, and you lose it. And we talked a little bit earlier about, how all the sources that people traditionally had depended on to provide sulfur to their fields is gone. It's not there anymore. It can be inadequate amounts of magnesium again. It can be inadequate amounts of nitrogen, where you're not getting proteins built from it because you don't have adequate nitrogen. But if you get all of the nitrogen that's taken up by that plant, well, the goal here is, we'll talk about this when we get to the biology and carbon fertility part. You really want that plant taking up its nitrogen as amino acids. You want them getting it as amino acids from microbes. That's the most energy efficient way. It's one of the ways you build energy efficiency in that plant, rather than supplying it as nitrate or ammonium in a nitrogen source you're putting on. It takes, in case I don't remember to mention it, nitrate is probably the worst nitrogen source you can put on. It takes 3 water molecules to metabolize nitrogen. So if you live in an area where you get very little water, or you're potentially in a drought situation, nitrogen is the worst thing to put on to provide nitrogen. You want to put an amino acid-based source on, or at least ammonium or nitrogen. It takes much less water and energy to metabolize, to allow for that water to be utilized other ways rather than metabolizing that nitrogen. Okay, so there's mineralization here. There are mineral elements that are required to have full protein metabolism, nitrate metabolism, nitrogen metabolism in the plant. If you have all of those, you will develop resistance to aphids, whiteflies, larval insects such as cabbage earworm, alfalfa weevil, tomato hornworm. You have any of those chewing caterpillars on any of your plants? Okay, you're not getting a complete nitrogen metabolism in your plant, and you're leaving a food source for them to eat, and that's what's attracting them to the plant. If you get the mineralization there that's necessary for full nitrogen metabolism within a 24-hour cycle, you will knock off. And I've seen this happen. It's interesting to watch it happen. Is if you recognize you're missing something and you foliar apply it, not just soil apply it. Now, knowing what the soil needs and actually getting it to a complete and balanced condition is the best way to approach this. But sometimes it can take you several years to get to where you want to be. So foliar applying it, can help you out within a growing season to reduce these problems or diseases or insects. Yeah, so spray it on with a sprayer. You mix a certain quantity of it in water and you spray it onto the plants with a sprayer. And it's interesting to watch these insects just disappear. They die because they consume a food source now. It's been converted. They die because they can't digest it and it rots in their gut of the insect and kills them. Or they just leave because they can't eat there anymore. So they just move on looking for a source of food that they can have. Oh, foliar spray. So it would depend on what you were needing. You can do leaf analysis or sap analysis, and it'll tell you what's lacking. But I'm trying to narrow it down to a few nutritional elements that's most likely it's one of those, like in nitrogen metabolism. It's going to be magnesium, nitrogen, sulfur, or molybdenum most of the time is the issue on that. And if you have a soil test, hopefully you can say, okay, well, I'm probably not adequate there yet, so I'm going to have to address those by spraying some on the plants to help them along with the process. If a plant's photorespirating, in other words, it's not photosynthesizing, it's too hot, it's shut down photosynthesis and it's now respirating, which means it's burning energy it already has, or it's going to have to break the plant down. And if it's having to break part of the plant down, and you get the ammonium nitrogen in there, if you just foliar apply an energy source, so it could be some molasses or even just powdered sugar, a little bit dissolved in there, and you foliar spray on there where the plant now has the energy to metabolize that ammonium nitrogen back into an amino acid, you can correct the problem and turn it. When it's hot, at a certain temperature, plants will shut down photosynthesis. This is another reason why you want to keep the soil at an even temperature, and there's lots of things you can do to raise that temperature to the highest level, but also to maximize energy production so that the plant has extra energy stored. So if it does have to shut down photosynthesis, it has reserve energy that it can burn and not have to go into proteolysis is what they call it, where it starts having to break itself down, its own tissue down to produce energy. It depends on the overall conditions, but once you're up around 90 degrees, 85, 90 degrees, depending on overall conditions, it depends on how well the plant can cool itself. It's not just the air temperature, but the temperature that the plant is feeling. And so if the plant can adequately transpire, it has the moisture and the humidity is lower, and it can effectively transpire and cool itself, the temperature may be able to be higher and it's still able to photosynthesize. Yeah. So if you start seeing some of these insects start to come to your crop, you can tell that you've got these free nitrogen compounds, either ammonium nitrogen or nitrate nitrogen in the tissue. And they're sending out messages. Like I said, that neon sign, the restaurant's open. They can smell, because I don't even know if we'll have time to talk about this. I think we will a little bit. The communication that's going on. Like how many of you have cell phones in this room? And that cell phone signal is flying all over in this room, but you don't notice it. You don't feel it, anything like that. You feel it sometimes. Well, I do too. I think we probably all do, and we just don't recognize what it is. But there's all of this communication going on in nature that we're not aware of. Yeah, the fact that an insect can smell something so far away, so tiny, and out in the wind, it can smell something so far. It's like my daughter has dogs, and when they go out One's well, she was supposed to be a Scotch collie, but she has some bloodhound in her. It was supposed to be a pure. It's a long story. I want to get into that. But you'll see her go out and put her nose in the air, sniffing, and then all of a sudden take off, and you're like, "What? You don't smell anything. You don't notice anything." But there's all this communication going on. Another way to illustrate it is to say, have you ever heard the saying? Somebody say, "Well, man, when that person walks into the room, they light it up." Or the opposite, when that person comes into the room, it gets really dark and gloomy. Well, it's the same kind of thing. It's like communication. Only about 10% of communication is verbal. It's all about expression and manner and the frequencies. And I don't want to get too esoteric here, but it's legitimate science. But the frequencies that are being given off quite often are ones that are very inviting and comforting, and sometimes they're not. They're off-putting. So anyway, do you want me to keep going on this? Or do you want to pick it up tomorrow morning? The first two levels on this are chemistry, and you have to have this chemistry, okay. If you're up to it. Okay, we're going to get to that. That's an entirely different level of challenge. You can, to a certain extent. Yeah. I'll explain it when we get up to the level. Let's just go through this. We'll talk about more of the details. I really just put this in here to illustrate to you how if the conditions are favorable, you will not have disease and insect pressure. Not by some magic, but by simply removing their food source. They no longer have the food source that's favorable to them, and so they no longer will come to the plant and attack it and do damage to it. And so you want to get the plant in a condition where it's not possible for them to proliferate. Okay, we'll just do the last two real quick, and we'll stop there. Level number 3 is storage of surplus energy. I had mentioned when it's full photosynthesis going on, you got full protein, nitrogen metabolism going on, and you're building complete proteins and complex carbohydrates. And a lot of this photosynthate and even some of these proteins are being dumped out into the soil and building these microbial populations. These microbial populations start supplying the plant with what's called microbial secondary metabolites. And we're going to talk about this a little more when we get into biology, so I won't go into a lot of it right now. But these metabolites are highly energy efficient. And so all of this energy that the plant would have to utilize and consume in order to build these molecules, they're getting them directly already built. And we'll talk when we get to the compost. This is what's so beneficial about compost, is the same thing. Is you have all these pre-made parts. And so if you have an assembly line for a car, for example, if you're having to make all those parts in the factory, and you have to wait on building the parts yourself and all the energy and everything. But if you acquire the already pre-built parts, they're brought in, you just put them on. Well, it's the same way with the plants. The plants can acquire these microbial secondary metabolites, as they're called, amino acids and other complex molecules that the plant needs that's pre-built for them. And so it saves them a tremendous amount of energy. And in doing that, with that surplus energy, I'll just read this here real quick so I don't miss anything. Energy is stored in the form of lipids, fats, and oils. Okay. Lipids build strong cell membranes for increased resistance to all airborne pathogens, parasites, disease, and UV radiation. So that surplus energy it makes for a thicker cell wall. It's basically oil, fat, lipids is built into that cell wall. It's built thicker. And when that actually happens, when you have the surplus energy being utilized that way, you actually are usually pulling in more calcium, you're pulling in silicon, you're building that cell wall like a fortress. And so a leaf-dwelling fungal organism like we mentioned early blight earlier, it secretes an organic acid that dissolves the cell wall, and that's how it gets access into the plant. But when the cell wall is built like this, the calcium neutralizes the acid, and it never has the ability and it's so thick it can't produce adequate amounts to penetrate. And the other thing on top of that is that the plant is actually providing food sources to the organisms on the leaf. So they don't have to eat the plant in order to get the food. And so you create this condition with surplus energy. It's a pressed down and overflowing condition that the Bible talks about, is where there's abundance for everybody to share. And so they start giving this as a food source. So you eliminate the airborne diseases on your leaves this way. And it happens exactly this way. Most people don't experience it because they don't have those conditions. But those problems will go away. Level number 4, just real quick. It comes from the production of plant secondary metabolites. This surplus energy is now building essential oils, I call it. All of these things we call beneficial, like lycopene and anthocyanin and bioflavonoids and I can't think of any more right off the top of my head here, but you know what I'm talking about. All these essential oils are highly protective to the plant. They actually discourage insects from eating on the plant. One thing I didn't mention in level 3 there is chewing insects. When you build a very strong cell wall with high calcium and silicon levels in it, if you've ever seen silicon under a microscope, it's like glass shards. But and you know what cement is. Cement is made from calcium silicate and everything. So when you put these things into the cell wall, in fact, they have photographs of the chewing parts of insects. The ones I remember the most are grasshoppers. But the chewing parts are totally worn off. They try to chew on it, and the abrasiveness of the calcium and silicon in the cell wall literally wears their teeth down, and they can't feed on it. Okay, back up to I just wanted to remember that one because we did. So these plant secondary metabolites that the plant starts to produce from the surplus energy here, as they act as plant protectants to guard against ultraviolet radiation, disease, and insect attack. And at this level, well, let me go. I didn't on number 3. Let's look at some of the other things. Resistance to downy mildew, powdery mildew, late blight, early blight, and others. Bacterial invaders such as fire blight, scab, rust, bacterial speck, and bacterial spot. All of these, once you build a cell wall better, are pretty much eliminated on it. Okay, up to level 4, where we have the plant secondary metabolites. This is passive and active immunity. The plant starts using compounds to produce an immune response to anything attacking the plant. And so, does anybody know what salicylic acid is? There's two. Salicylic acid is aspirin. There are two pathways here, the ISR and the SAR, induced systemic response, and it's actually moderated or modulated by salicylic acid, aspirin. And in fact, they tried to develop the ability to use aspirin for this very reason in plants. They never could perfect it like plants can. So they were killing plants because they didn't know what levels and when and all that kind of stuff. And then jasmonic acid moderates the SAR pathway, which is systemically acquired resistance. It's another immune response that the plant generates when it gets to this level. And it's a response just to make sure that the plant is fully functioning. But these compounds that are produced there are actually where medicine is for us when the plant gets to that level of function. And to answer the question about the big animals, when these essential oils, when they start to be generated in the plant, some of them are very disturbing to the digestive system of larger animals, and so they don't want to eat it. So they'll leave crops alone or they'll minimize how much they eat on them. So you can minimize it by getting it to this level where the larger animals will leave crops alone that they would otherwise. They'll go to other crops. They prefer nutritious food too. So it's not a matter, but they'll prefer some crops over other crops at that point, like grass instead of your sweet potatoes or your green beans. They'll prefer other plants because of the compounds that are being generated. They don't like it. It disturbs their digestive system, and they prefer to leave it alone. So anyway, we didn't get into all this, but let me read one more in 4. It says the production of phytolexins in stage 4, it's just an essential oil compound, is based on the lipids produced in stage 3, the fats or oils. These aromatic, quote, essential oil compounds are natural plant protection compounds that contain pesticidal properties of their own. In other words, they're not pesticidal in the fact that they will kill the pest if they try to eat too much of it, but they just won't eat because they don't like it. They don't like the taste, what it produces in their digestive system and everything. So that's where the medicine is. You get to that level, the bottom 2 are chemistry, the top 2 are biological. So you've got to get the chemistry first, and once you have that, you can achieve the top 2. This is why hydroponically produced food will never produce food as medicine, because you'll never get the biological aspect of it out of it. So, okay, we'll stop there. We'll pick up in the morning. From there, we'll talk about weeds. You'll be happy to know that it's the same reality. Well, we'll talk about it tomorrow. If anybody has any questions, I'll hang around here for a few minutes and I'll be happy to answer it for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brother Whitmore. I know you have a question. Don't worry. We're going to get to your questions. So right now it's camp time activity, fun. We're inviting everybody outside. Let's have some fun together. Right? That sounds good? Yeah. No, it doesn't. Some people are looking at me like I did something wrong. We're going to have some fun, guys. So let us pray. And we're going to spend a few minutes before worship and have some fun, right? What time is worship again? 6:45. So up until 6:45, we're going to have some fun together. All right? Let's pray. If you don't mind standing with me, please.
Father in heaven, once again, we're just thankful that you have great love towards us. And your desire is that we would prosper in life, not just survive. And we just pray that as we pursue a knowledge of these subjects, that you would help our minds to be receptive and to retain the information and to be able to implement it in our own individual circumstances. And we just pray that whatever we do, that all would bring glory to you in Jesus' name. Amen.